Imagine sitting across from the FDA and you're sliding a pivotal clinical trial report across the table.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And the raw data on your novel implantable device shows an 80% serious adverse event rate. 80%.
Which is just, I mean, that's catastrophic on paper.
Right. And your acute kidney injury rate is sitting at 40%. Under the traditional regulatory paradigm, a quality and regulatory affairs VP looking at those numbers is doing two things. Drafting the project as postmortem and quietly updating their resume.
Exactly. You're packing your desk.
Because the assumption has always been that safety thresholds are rigid, objective lines in the sand. But in a landmark case, one sponsor took that exact data, that brutal 80% SAE rate, and used it to secure a PMA approval.
It's wild.
Today, we are unpacking the mechanism that made that possible. Our mission in this deep dive is to equip you, the QRA executive, with a highly strategic, technical, and ROI-focused blueprint of the FDA's March 30, 2026 Patient Preference Information, or PPI, final guidance.
And the paradigm shift here is just profound. When we look at this 33-page final guidance document, along with the detailed regulatory breakdowns we've sourced from RAPS, Pure Global, and an audio case study of that exact PMA rescue we just mentioned, a completely new regulatory architecture emerges.
Yeah.
I mean, the historical mindset dictated that the FDA alone decided what constituted a mathematically acceptable safety profile.
Right. They held all the carbs.
Exactly. But the 2026 guidance fundamentally rewrites the benefit-risk equation across the total product lifecycle, the TPLC. The FDA now formally accepts rigorous mathematical proof of a patient's personal risk tolerance as valid scientific evidence.
So the subjective desperation of a patient population has been converted into a quantifiable, heavily regulated statistical model.
That's exactly it. It's taking human emotion and putting it on a utility curve.
And that conversion is what generates the executive ROI. Because before we get into the heavy compliance mandates of how to actually design these studies, the strict rules in Section V of the guidance, we have to establish why a QRA VP should be allocating budget to this in the first place.
Yeah, because these studies aren't cheap.
No, they're not. We're talking about rescuing borderline clinical trials, securing subpopulation approvals, radically downsizing clinical trial enrollment targets, and in some cases, bypassing clinical trials entirely for indication expansions.
Right.
But to unlock any of that, we have to isolate a fundamental industry trap first. There is a persistent, expensive misconception that patient-reported outcomes, PROs, and patient preference information, PPI, are interchangeable.
Oh, yeah. And conflating those two will guarantee a rejected submission. See it all the time. A PRO is a snapshot of clinical efficacy.
Right.
You ask a patient to rate their joint pain on a scale of 1 to 10 after receiving an orthopedic implant, or, you have them fill out a standardized quality of life questionnaire at a 6-month follow-up. It simply measures how the patient feels as a direct result of the therapy. It is data generated by the device's performance. PPI is entirely different. Patient preference information measures the complex, hypothetical trade-offs a patient is willing to make before they ever receive the therapy.
It captures the value they assign to specific clinical outcomes versus specific clinical risks.
Exactly. The question shifts from, does this device reduce your daily pain, to, would you accept a 20% absolute risk of a systemic infection up front and a 10% risk of a surgical revision in exchange for a 50% probability of eliminating your daily pain?
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so PPI maps the breaking point of the patient's risk tolerance. It establishes preference heterogeneity, acknowledging that the theoretical average patient doesn't exist. Some patients are highly risk-averse. Others are willing to accept massive safety risks to achieve a specific benefit.
Which brings us back to the alpha pump case study, because this is the perfect distillation of preference-sensitive decision-making rescuing a seemingly doomed PMA.
Oh, absolutely.
So the alpha pump is a wirelessly charged implant designed for adult patients with liver cirrhosis who suffer from refractory ascites, which is a condition where massive, debilitating amounts of fluid accumulate in the abdomen.
And the baseline standard of care for these patients is incredibly severe. It involves large volume paracentesis, or LVP.
Which is awful.
It's brutal. Patients must travel to a clinic every week or two, have a large bore needle inserted into their abdomen, and remain there while several liters of fluid are physically drained.
Right.
It utterly dominates their existence, stripping away mobility, autonomy, quality of life. So Sequana Medical ran the Poseidon pivotal trial to test the alpha pump against this baseline.
And the data from Poseidon yielded that 80% serious adverse event rate through 24 months, alongside the 40% acute kidney injury rate. Pump pocket infections, catheter blockages requiring surgical intervention.
Yeah, tough numbers.
It's really tough. If you look at this purely from a traditional objective safety threshold, the device appears unapprovable. My immediate thought as a regulatory strategist looking at that is liability and statutory obligation. The FDA's mandate is to ensure safety and efficacy. How does factoring in a patient's subjective hatred of their standard of care circumvent the statutory requirement that a device must be safe? I mean, risk is risk. An 80% SAE is an 80% SAE.
Well, see, the 2026 guidance clarifies that safety is no longer a monolithic, uniform threshold applied indiscriminately across all therapeutic areas. Safety is now relative to the mathematically validated preference of the end user.
Okay, so how did they prove that mathematically?
To capture this, the sponsor partnered with RTI Health Solutions to conduct a discrete choice experiment, a DCE. And the FDA views a properly structured DCE as valid scientific evidence. In a DCE, you do not just ask a patient, hey, would you like this pump? You force them into a structured, exhaustive series of trade-offs. You present Profile A, which entirely eliminates the need for paracentesis, but carries a high risk of kidney injury and surgical revision.
Okay.
Then you present Profile B, which only reduces paracentesis frequency by half, but carries zero surgical risk.
The methodology here is critical because they are generating a utility curve, right?
Exactly. The respondent is taken through perhaps 15 or 20 of these choice tasks. The attributes, so the risk of infection, risk of kidney injury, reduction in paracentesis, are constantly varied using an orthogonal experimental design to ensure statistical independence.
Right.
By analyzing these choices using a mixed logic model, the statisticians can calculate the exact beta coefficients. That's the relative weight the patient population assigns to each attribute. They pinpoint the exact moment the patient says, okay, the risk is now too high, I will just stick with the needle.
This operates a lot like corporate financial hedging or actuarial risk modeling.
Yes.
You are identifying a known, quantifiable, high-yield risk, in this case, the revision surgery, and accepting it to eliminate a systemic, debilitating baseline cost, which is the paracentesis. The utility curve mathematically proved that patients were willing to accept a greater than 35% risk of a minor procedure, like a device explant or revision, to escape their standard of care.
When you overlay that mathematically validated threshold onto the clinical data from the Poseidon trial, the narrative completely flips.
Yeah.
The actual trial rate for minor revisions was 20%. So while 20% looks catastrophic on a traditional risk matrix, it is 15 percentage points below the patient's maximum acceptable risk, the MAR.
That's fascinating.
Right. The FDA evaluated the clinical data through the lens of the utility curve. The subjective desperation of the cirrhosis patient was converted into a quantified minimal acceptable benefit, AMA. Because the device's performance fell safely within the validated preference threshold of that specific subpopulation, the PMA was approved.
That concept, the minimal acceptable benefit, is a massive lever for QRA leaders because it allows you to define highly specific performance goals. If you can define the MA mathematically, you can potentially downsize costly clinical trial enrollment targets.
Huge cost savings there.
Absolutely. You aren't powering a trial to prove an arbitrary safety margin. You are powering it to clear the specific patient-validated MA. And in some cases, it allows you to completely bypass a new clinical trial, which is exactly what happened with the hemodialysis 510K indication expansion.
Oh, this is one of my favorite examples.
Yeah.
This specific case study highlights the immense strategic value of PPI in the post-market expansion phase. So, a manufacturer had a hemodialysis device currently cleared under a 510K for home use.
Okay.
However, the existing labeling strictly required a trained caregiver to be present during the therapy. The sponsor wanted to expand the indication to allow for solo home use, granting the patient complete autonomy.
The roadblock there is immediate and obvious. You cannot run a clinical trial for that indication.
No.
No institutional review board on the planet is going to approve a trial protocol where you intentionally leave a hemodialysis patient alone in a room to see how many of them experience a fatal needle dislodgement and bleed out.
Yeah, that's not happening.
The clinical pathway was completely blocked.
So with a clinical trial off the table, the sponsor pivoted to a PPI strategy. However, instead of a discrete choice experiment like we saw with the alpha pump, they utilized the threshold technique, or TT.
Right.
The threshold technique is the optimal statistical model when you have a single fixed clinical benefit, in this case, the total autonomy of solo therapy, And you need to find the maximum acceptable limit for a specific severe risk.
So they tested the risk of death and the risk of needle dislodgement.
Yes.
They surveyed 142 patients. And the threshold technique forces the patient to weigh that single fixed benefit against incrementally increasing probabilities of the catastrophic risk. The data proved that the patient population heavily valued their autonomy. They were statistically willing to accept the higher, potentially fatal risks of solo therapy in exchange for not having to rely on a caregiver.
And the result was that the FDA reviewed the threshold technique data, accepted the mathematically validated preference threshold, and granted the 510K indication expansion. The sponsor secured a major market advantage without ever enrolling a single patient in a new, impossible clinical trial. Millions of dollars and years of development time were saved because they successfully converted subjective patient preference into objective regulatory data.
But the underlying reality here is that capturing that ROI is incredibly difficult.
Oh, Billy.
It requires navigating a highly prescriptive minefield of regulatory design rules. Because the FDA didn't just open the floodgates and say, hey, send us your surveys.
No.
Section V of the final guidance outlines strict compliance mandates. If a QRA team does not execute these methodologies perfectly, the FDA will outright reject the multi-million-dollar PREFEX study. The most immediate compliance trap involves how the survey is administered to the patient.
Right. Historically, a sponsor might contract a third-party vendor to email a survey link to a patient panel. The patient clicks through it on their phone while watching television, and the sponsor submits the resulting data.
Right.
The 2026 guidance explicitly bans this casual approach. If a preference survey is self-administered, meaning the patient is completing it independently, without real-time guidance and moderation from trained clinical research, staff participants are now required to complete a mandatory educational tutorial followed by a formal comprehension quiz before they're even allowed to view the preference questions.
And this isn't just a basic I agree checkbox at the bottom of a terms and conditions page. The sponsor has to document the results of those comprehension quizzes and submit them as supportive evidence in the regulatory filing. If you cannot objectively prove that the respondent thoroughly understood the clinical trade-offs being presented, the FDA considers the entire data set invalid.
The statistical reasoning behind this mandate is sound. If a patient does not genuinely comprehend the difference between a transient acute kidney injury and a chronic systemic infection, the utility curve generated by their choices is mathematically worthless.
Yeah.
It is noise. The FDA requires you to prove you have isolated the true preference signal from the noise of misunderstanding, which leads to another critical boundary established in the guidance, the commercial cost prohibition outlined in Section VG.
QRA executives need to monitor this closely when their marketing and commercial teams get involved in survey design. When you are establishing the attributes, the specific variables the patient will weigh against each other, they must be framed neutrally, and you absolutely must exclude any commercial cost variables. You cannot ask a patient if they would accept a device with a slightly higher failure rate if it saved them $500 out of pocket.
Yeah, marketing teams always try to sneak that in.
Did they do?
But the FDA's statutory authority is limited to evaluating clinical safety and clinical efficacy. They do not possess the statutory mandate to regulate pricing, insurance reimbursement tiers, or hospital purchasing contracts.
Right.
Including a financial cost attribute in a regulatory preference survey fundamentally corrupts the clinical risk model. It introduces a non-clinical confounding variable. If the FDA detects that financial costs influence the patient's risk tolerance in the data, the study is invalidated for regulatory decision-making.
Because it creates an artificial risk threshold. A patient might accept a dangerous device simply because they are economically disadvantaged, which the FDA obviously cannot use as a justification for clinical safety.
Exactly.
So you have to eliminate the financial variables, but communicating the actual clinical variables accurately brings up a massive psychological hurdle. Section VI focuses heavily on minimizing cognitive bias and addressing health numeracy.
Yeah, health numeracy refers to a patient's capacity to process, interpret, and act on statistical risk information. The general population struggles immensely with probability and statistics.
Oh, for sure.
The FDA recognizes this, and the guidance is incredibly prescriptive about the formatting and presentation of statistical risk to prevent sponsors from manipulating patient perception.
The banned practices read like a textbook on what medical device marketing teams do every day. You are prohibited from using fractions. You cannot use decimals because patient might see 0.02 and 0.2 and fail to immediately grasp the magnitude of the difference. You absolutely cannot use changing denominators. You cannot say 1 in 5 patients experiences localized pain, but 3 in 50 experience an infection.
That specific prohibition addresses denominator neglect. When patients see 1 in 5 versus 20 in 100, they often perceive 1 in 5 as a more significant threat because the numerator represents a larger proportion of the stated denominator, even though the absolute probability is identical.
Right, it feels bigger.
Exactly. To eliminate this cognitive distortion, the FDA mandates the use of absolute frequencies with a consistent denominator, such as 20 in 1,000.
They also ban purely verbal descriptions of risk. You cannot label an attribute as having a high risk of revision or a low risk of revision.
Because verbal descriptions are entirely subjective anchors. A patient who has endured 5 invasive surgeries might consider a 20% revision rate low risk, while a patient newly diagnosed with a condition might consider a 5% risk catastrophically high. The FDA requires the subjective feeling to be anchored to an objective absolute frequency. Furthermore, the guidance explicitly mandates the use of validated visual aids, specifically 100% icon grids.
It's a very specific graphical representation. You display an array of 100 small human figures, all shaded in one color, with 2 figures shaded in a contrasting color to visually represent a 2% risk.
Yeah, it's very clear.
Additionally, the guidance forces sponsors to frame the uncertainty in both positive and negative lights to eliminate framing bias. You cannot just state that there is a 20% chance of an adverse event. You must simultaneously state that there is an 80% chance of experiencing no adverse events.
Yes, you have to present the whole picture.
But looking at this from an executive strategy level, I have a fundamental question about the cognitive science here.
Okay, let's hear it.
We know human beings are not supercomputers. Even if you meticulously design a 100% icon grid and use absolute frequencies, a patient reviewing a complex discrete choice experiment is naturally going to suffer from cognitive fatigue. Oh, absolutely.
They're going to mentally recode those precise statistical grids back into heuristic buckets of low, medium, and high just to get through the survey. It cares how the human brain simplifies complex data. If the patient is ultimately going to use a heuristic shortcut anyway, why is the FDA so rigidly obsessed with the exact graphical formatting of these grids?
Well, the FDA is fully aware of heuristic recoding. In fact, the statisticians at CDRH actively hunt for it in your data. The FDA relies on formal statistical tests within the survey structure itself to detect this exact behavior. One common heuristic is lexicographic behavior.
Lexicographic behavior.
Yeah, where a respondent becomes overwhelmed by the complexity of the choice task and simply focuses on a single dominant attribute, say, the risk of infection, ignoring all other variables entirely.
Ah, I see.
If a survey is poorly designed or lacks visual clarity, it exacerbates this cognitive fatigue and encourages extreme heuristic recoding, which completely flattens the nuance of the utility curve.
Got it. The visual grids are designed to enforce a minimum cognitive load. They force the patient's brain to repeatedly confront the objective, proportional reality of the math. During the analysis phase, statisticians use consistency checks and holdout tasks. So, presenting the same choice in a different format later in the survey to measure the rate of heuristic use.
That's clever.
It is. If the grids and tutorials were effective, the patient's choices will demonstrate a consistent, nuanced weighting of all attributes. The FDA demands these specific visual formats because they mathematically reduce the noise of cognitive fatigue, ensuring the resulting utility curve reflects a genuine clinical threshold rather than a stressed patient's gut reaction.
So the formatting is essentially a required mechanism to protect the statistical integrity of the utility curve. That makes complete sense. But that brings us to the operational reality. You can spend $2 million contracting a health economics firm to build the most robust, visually compliant, mathematically perfect, discrete choice experiment in the world. But if you field that survey and then hand the final report to the FDA, they will likely dismiss it entirely if they didn't agree to the foundational parameters first.
Oh, executing a PPI study in a silo is a fatal strategic error. The Q submission program is the operational battleground where the success or failure of a patient preference study is determined. A sponsor must submit their proposed methodology, specifically their attribute tables, to the FDA for formal alignment well before a single patient is tested.
And the attribute table is the structural skeleton of the survey. It maps the patient-facing clinical labels to the actual statistical ranges you expect to see in your forthcoming clinical trial.
Right.
If your engineering and clinical teams project that your novel device might carry a 10 to 15% localized infection rate, your attribute table must test patient tolerance across that spectrum, and ideally push slightly beyond it, perhaps testing up to 20 or 25%.
Because the FDA's stance on extrapolation is absolute. Extrapolating preference data beyond the specific tested attribute levels is considered mathematically invalid. The relative weights that patients assign to clinical trade-offs must be elicited directly through the choice tasks.
Right.
You cannot test patient tolerance up to a 15% risk and then use a linear regression to mathematically infer what their tolerance would be at a 20% risk.
No.
The FDA will reject the inferred data because preference curves are rarely linear. A patient's risk tolerance might cliff drop at 16%.
Let's evaluate the risk management aspect of this. We are sitting in a Q-sub meeting, locking in this attribute table. We use the Q-sub to call our shot in advance, much like playing billiards. You have to declare exactly which pocket you're aiming for. You cannot wildly strike the cue ball, sink the 8-ball off 3 cushions by accident, and claim it was your intended strategy. You must declare the analytical intent.
That's a great analogy.
But what happens if the clinical reality diverges from our Q-sub projection? Let's say our regulatory team aligns with the FDA to test a revision rate up to 20%. We execute the survey, and the utility curve clearly shows patients will accept a 20% risk. We then run our multi-year pivotal trial, and the final data shows an actual revision rate of 22%.
Oh.
Because the FDA forbids extrapolation, are we forced to scrap the entire preference study because our clinical trial missed the tested range by 2 percentage points?
That exact scenario is the nightmare keeping QRA directors awake, and it is precisely why broad range setting during the Q-sub phase is a high-stakes negotiation.
Yeah.
If your pivotal trial data falls outside the maximum upper bound established in your PPI study, your preference data no longer covers the clinical reality of the device. The FDA cannot apply the utility curve to the device. The sponsor is left in an incredibly vulnerable position.
That's brutal.
You may be forced to design and field a rapid, expensive bridging study to test the higher ranges, or in the worst-case scenario, start the preference study over entirely.
Wow.
So the strategic imperative during the Q-sub is to establish a maximum acceptable risk, a MAR, that stretches comfortably beyond your worst-case clinical projections. However, the FDA will push back if you stretch the ranges too far.
Of course.
If you test a 50% risk of catastrophic failure for a device intended to treat a minor cosmetic issue, the FDA will argue that the choice task is clinically absurd and lacks real-world validity, causing patients to treat the survey like a video game rather than a medical decision.
Right.
The Q-sub negotiation is a delicate balancing act between securing a wide safety net for your clinical trial and maintaining the clinical realism of the survey instrument.
That requires deep alignment between the clinical trial designers, the regulatory strategists, and the health economists before you ever speak to the agency.
Absolutely.
Another critical element of the Q-sub alignment is the pre-specified statistical analysis plan in the SAP.
Yeah, the 2026 guidance places a heavy emphasis on the SAP to prevent data dredging, or p-hacking. You cannot run a preference survey, dump the raw data into an analytical software package, and then continuously slice and reslice the patient demographics until you magically discover a subpopulation whose utility curve perfectly aligns with your subpar clinical trial data.
Right. You have to lock in the mathematical models up front. You must formally declare your primary endpoints, your specific analytical models, whether that is a mixed logit or a latent class analysis, and define your target clinical subgroups before the data is unblinded.
Because if you fail to pre-specify the SAP, the FDA will view any favorable subpopulation analysis as highly exploratory and likely biased by the sponsor's desire to find a path to approval. Speaking of subgroups and specific populations, the guidance also clarifies the pathway for utilizing outside U.S. or OUS preference data under 21 CFR 812.28.
For global medtech organizations running decentralized or international clinical trials, this is a massive operational factor. The FDA has stated they will accept OUS preference data, but the regulatory burden of proof shifts heavily onto the sponsor. You have to definitively prove cultural and health system applicability.
Yes. The underlying mechanism here is that risk tolerance is intimately tied to socioeconomic context.
Right.
A patient residing in a European country with a robust, nationalized social safety net comprehensive disability coverage, and zero out-of-pocket healthcare costs might evaluate the risk of a severe adverse event entirely differently than a patient in the United States.
That makes total sense.
Furthermore, the baseline standard of care might vary significantly between regions. If a QRA leader submits a discrete choice experiment conducted entirely with patients in Germany, they must provide a formal, evidence-based justification detailing why the German standard of care and risk tolerance profile directly translates to the specific patient population in Ohio or Texas.
And if they don't buy it?
If the FDA determines that socioeconomic variables confound the risk profile, they will disregard the OUS data.
The strategy clearly requires rigorous upfront planning. But the value of a meticulously executed PPI study extends far beyond the moment the FDA hands over the PMA or 510(k) clearance. The guidance details how this data impacts the device across the entire total product lifecycle. Moving into the post-market phase, one of the most aggressive and highly strategic applications of PPI is deploying it as a post-market compliance and enforcement shield.
This represents a fascinating evolution in FDA enforcement discretion. The guidance explicitly reveals how robust patient preference information influences the agency's decisions regarding administrative actions, enforcement protocols, and compliance crackdowns.
Okay, lay this out for us.
Consider a scenario where a device has been on the market for 3 years, and a post-market surveillance signal identifies that the device is technically not conforming to a specific performance standard.
Historically, a technical nonconformance almost automatically triggers a recall, a cessation of distribution, or a warning letter. The regulatory reflex is to pull the product.
However, if that specific device addresses a severe unmet medical need and the sponsor possesses a mathematically robust, FDA-validated PPI study proving that patients desperately demand access to the therapy despite knowing its specific clinical risks, that utility curve acts as a regulatory shield.
Wow.
The FDA is formally instructed to weigh that validated patient demand during their internal enforcement deliberations. They may opt for enforcement discretion, allowing the product to remain on the market for the patients who need it most, while the sponsor addresses the nonconformance in the background.
It provides the FDA with the mathematical cover they need to keep a non-conforming but critical device in the hands of physicians.
Exactly.
But there is a massive operational trade-off. If you win pre-market approval, or if you secure post-market enforcement discretion based heavily on preference data, the FDA will almost certainly mandate strict conditions of approval regarding product labeling.
Yeah, the data cannot live exclusively in a regulatory filing cabinet. The FDA requires the sponsor to translate the complex beta coefficients and utility curves of the discrete choice model into plain language, patient-facing documents known as shared decision-making tools.
These tools function as informed consent forms on a completely different operational level.
Oh, they are highly structured clinical documents. The guidance stipulates that physicians must physically walk through these tools with the individual patient in the examination room before the device is prescribed or implanted.
Right.
The objective is to verify that the specific patient sitting on the exam table genuinely shares the exact risk tolerance profile of the mathematical model that justified the device's approval in the first place. The physician uses the tool to confirm, are you, the individual, willing to accept this specific 30% risk to achieve this specific benefit, just as the study cohort was?
That ensures the macro-level statistical model accurately maps to the micro-level clinical reality of the individual. But I want to scrutinize the boundaries of this enforcement shield concept because there is a very dangerous extrapolation a QRA team could make here.
Okay.
If a company gets hit with a devastating 483 observation or a warning letter for a blatant systemic manufacturing defect, let's say they have a massive sterile barrier failure on the packaging line, or their software engineering is completely undocumented and riddled with catastrophic bugs, they cannot simply slide a utility curve across the table and argue, yes, our quality system is a disaster, but the patients are desperate, so you must let us keep selling it. There has to be a hard statutory limit to preference data.
Oh, absolutely. There is an absolute limit, and the FDA aggressively defines it in Section IXE of the guidance, which covers the hard safety limits.
Okay, good.
PPI is a highly sophisticated regulatory lever. It evaluates and quantifies clinical risk tolerance. It is not a get-out-of-jail-free card for systemic operational failures. Patient preference information cannot, under any circumstances, override basic design flaws, shoddy engineering practices, or blatant manufacturing defects.
Right.
A manufacturer cannot design a fundamentally defective product, fail to adhere to basic quality system regulations, and then weaponize patient desperation as an excuse to secure an approval or deflect a warning letter.
Makes sense.
The FDA draws a very sharp, impenetrable boundary between a patient mathematically accepting the inherent unavoidable clinical risks of a novel, life-saving therapy versus a manufacturer failing to execute basic quality assurance. If your sterile barrier is failing, no amount of patient preference data will prevent a mandatory recall.
That distinction protects the structural integrity of the entire regulatory framework. It allows for flexibility and clinical risk without compromising the baseline standards of manufacturing quality. So, as we synthesize this blueprint for the quality and regulatory VPs listening today, the core takeaway is absolute. Patient preference is no longer a soft, qualitative afterthought.
No, it's not.
It is not anecdotal evidence relegated to marketing brochures or focus groups.
It has been elevated to quantitative, valid scientific evidence governed by strict statistical rules.
When executed correctly, adhering strictly to the Section V design rules and leveraging the Q-sub process to lock in the SAP and attribute tables, PPI can rescue borderline pivotal trials like the alpha pump.
Which leaves us with a final, highly strategic concept to consider, drawn directly from the Pure Global regulatory analysis. Pure Global noted a critical alignment. This 2026 FDA guidance aligns conceptually with the foundational principles of the European Union Medical Device Regulation and in vitro diagnostic regulation, specifically regarding post-market clinical follow-up, or PMCF.
The international implications there are massive.
Consider the long-term global strategy. If a U.S.-based regulatory team successfully utilizes a complex discrete choice experiment to mathematically justify a 20% revision rate to the FDA and secures a PMA based on that utility curve, how will the notified bodies in Europe react to that exact same math?
That's the million-dollar question.
Will global QRA leaders eventually leverage U.S.-approved quantitative patient preference data to force notoriously rigid European regulators into alignment during PMCF reviews? Could this FDA guidance effectively become a global regulatory Trojan horse, standardizing the mathematical proof of risk tolerance across international borders?
That is a strategic avenue every VP should be actively mapping out with their global regulatory teams. It highlights the profound evolution of this field. We began this deep dive discussing rigid safety thresholds and objective lines in the sand. But as the 2026 guidance proves, when you apply rigorous statistical modeling to the messy, subjective reality of human suffering and preference, the regulatory landscape doesn't become murkier. It actually becomes more precise. It just demands an entirely new level of executive navigation.